Thank you. Good evening and good morning and good afternoon, I think, to everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Chris and Oliver for their organisation and for inviting me. We were, of course, to be in Warwick today, but I just really admire their patience and determination to continue and to find a way forward, which I think the way that things are at the moment, it's just such a good thing to see, sort of new connections and the possibility to perhaps speak with those who wouldn't have been able to make it to come to Warwick. So thanks so much, Chris and Oliver, for your patience and your determination to continue. So the themes of your colloquium on autonomy and freedom are very thought-provoking themes, and they are of great interest to me through the recent work that I've done on machine learning algorithms. So much of what I'm going to say today is a kind of slice through my most recent book, Cloud Ethics, and in particular where I address the issues of machine learning algorithms, which are so often referred to as involved in autonomous decisions, for example, or are described as involved in unsupervised learning and automation. So stretching from the biometric border controls and the security algorithms that I've written about elsewhere, to, of course, drones and autonomous weapon systems, and of course the targeting algorithms for, as you can see in this Cambridge Analytica advertisement here that I took from their website before they took it down, where they were describing changing audience behaviour in commercial advertising and of course in electoral outcomes, so used both in the US presidential election and in the EU referendum. So in my talk this evening, I'd like to pose a question to myself and to all of us, which is really, what can autonomy and freedom mean in an age of machine learning algorithms? And in one sense, we might say, well, this is clear, it's self-evident that somehow the autonomous outputs of algorithms are limiting human freedoms. And I think this is so often the kind of, the sort of commonplace understanding that somehow there's some autonomy gained by the machine and that this in some way limits the freedom of humans, that it undermines rights and limits life chances. But I want to suggest something else, and I guess for me, even more troubling than these things, which is that actually our collaborations and our relations to ourselves and others, as they are reformulated through machine learning algorithms, are actually redefining what freedom and autonomy could mean in the world. So not only a question of a kind of a threat to already guaranteed rights in a sense, but actually a reconfiguring of what we might mean when we say rights. So let's situate this so that we can think about that in context. So taking us back 4 years, it's 2016, and I'm watching a technology company, a small startup, pitching what they call their protest detection software to a UK audience of government and corporate clients. And the presenter explains to the audience, he says, we train our algorithm to understand what a protest is and is not. And the places that are used in the training are scrolling across the bottom of the screen. There's Islamabad, Paris, Baltimore, Istanbul, Syria. And these are deep learning algorithms that are drawing on the inputs of social media data, biometric data, geospatial data, combined with government cloud databases to output, in effect, a risk score in the context of protests. So the question then is, what does the presence of these algorithms mean for public life, for what we might think of as the freedoms to gather and assemble with others to bring a political claim in public space? And we know, of course, as recently as only a month ago, that facial recognition algorithms being used in the UK in the Black Lives Matter protests. But for the people of Baltimore in 2015, who were protesting the police killing of the 25-year-old African-American man, Freddie Gray, These algorithms meant that the Baltimore Police Department and the Department of Homeland Security were seeking what they were calling disruptive civil unrest. So on that April day, terabytes of images, social media text and video data was being analysed by a company, Geophedia. You can see here their use of the Baltimore protests as what they call a case study of the use of their algorithms. You can see in the use of the case study that they're describing Freddie Gray as having passed away in Baltimore. And they go on to describe what they say is an opportunity for the city police to use data. So the advert reads, "The minute his death was announced, we knew we needed to monitor social media data at key locations." So people were arrested and detained on the basis of machine learning algorithms. A group of high school kids were prevented from boarding a bus to join the protests, their clustered data yielding an output that they would pose a high risk to the crowd. So these algorithms, having been trained on data from the many contingent events of past gatherings of crowds in other places, are refined and optimized before moving on to a future event. You can see here in a screenshot from the London presentation, clustering, scoring the sentiment and the momentum. So in protest detection, the residue of past events in an Istanbul park or a US city become lodged within the very algorithms that will continue to target other faces, objects and sentiments in other crowds, even and perhaps especially those who've never been encountered before. So what might we say is at stake here? I want to say that this is not only a question of the power of algorithms to somehow limit a freedom or to undermine a democratic process or decide a police deployment to preempt a protest. So for me, of perhaps even greater significance than these manifest harms, algorithms are constituting what that protest, what that democracy, what that border crossing or social movement could be in the world. So then the capacity to make a political claim on the future, perhaps in this case even to board a bus to make that claim, is somewhat foreclosed by a set of algorithmic methods that are modelling the attributes in advance. So we might say, well, what new thing could happen in the world through this gathering of people when the attributes are thought to already be known in advance? And I think that this means that some of our sort of reflex recourse to the protection of rights and freedoms, and of course this has provided much of the terrain for the challenge of these kinds of techniques on the grounds of privacy or freedom of association, freedom of assembly. And we might perhaps most commonly think of these things as being attached to rights-bearing subjects. But I want to say that these, of course, and we talked about this last night, already insufficient ways of thinking about freedom and thinking about rights and subjects, so always insufficient and found wanting, is through the use of machine learning algorithms exposed once more in terms of limitations. So I think I want to say that we are, if you like, none of us autonomous as such. And this again was raised last night in the discussion, the question of the self as a relational being in relation to others. Now, so I may feel that some notion of my freedom is protected through particular measures. And this is in the book what I'm trying to critique, really, which is the drive by governments and by tech companies to generate what I call in the book an encoded form of ethics. So to think about extracting bias, or to think about more fair methods for training algorithms, and so on. So I might feel that these measures somehow protect a notion of freedom, but even then, the attributes and clusters generated from my data in correlation with yours and those of unknown others will continue to supply the conditions for future arbitrary actions against unknown others. And this is the kind of cloud ethics that I'm trying to get to, this notion of a relationality to others, many of whom we can never directly know. So then it could never only be a matter of guaranteeing freedoms. The I, as Judith Butler proposes in her Spinoza lectures, is always in question. She says, my account of myself is partial, haunted by that which I cannot see. I am, she says, dispossessed by my relations with others. So in some ways, what appears to us and is so often described to us as a black box of opacity or illegibility of the algorithm should not, I think, pose an entirely new problem for us. For the difficulty of locating a clear-sighted account of something we might call autonomous action was already present. In short, autonomy was always already in question. How do we repose that question now for the way that we live our lives in and through what are described as machine autonomies? So let's think about then what this notion of autonomies might mean and how we could maybe rethink about this in the context of algorithms. I think where there has been widespread concern about the intensification of the use of deep learning algorithms in society, everything from sentencing decisions through to identification of individuals at borders, this has most commonly hinged on notions of the degree of autonomy afforded to machines vis-à-vis the human. And I want to say that this is a problematic formulation. I want us to stay with this for a moment and kind of think about this idea of degrees of autonomy in relation to humans, because I think there are some problems for us to think through, and they are not new problems in some ways. So I'm taking us back here to 1952, when BBC Radio recorded what I think might have been the world's first public debate on the capacity for autonomous action by machines. The discussion was called, "Can automatic calculating machines be said to think?" And involved in the discussion was the Manchester neurosurgeon Geoffrey Jefferson and his mathematician colleague Alan Turing. And he asked Turing, well, but Alan, who was learning, you or the machine? So for the neurosurgeon, there was an absolute emphasis on an essence of human agency, perhaps even an essence of human agency located in the brain. And the audio recording of the debate shows that Turing reflects on the question that his colleague asks before he replies, "I suppose we both were." So Turing says, "I'm inclined to believe that when one has taught the machine to do certain things, one will find that some other things that one had planned to teach it are happening without any special teaching being required." So for the philosopher in the debate, Richard Braithwaite, there still remains something distinct to the autonomies afforded to humans and animals. So he says the peculiarity of men and animals is that they have the power of adjusting themselves to almost all the features of their environment. And this notion of adjustment of features, which Braithwaite in the 50s ascribed to human and animals, I think today is central to algorithms' capacities for action in relation to the data features of their environment, where it's really come to mean exposing a deep learning algorithm to a volume of data, making it possible to identify clusters and patterns in the data and adjusting to those features. And that is how that protest detection software is working, learning through each new exposure to a set of clusters and patterns in data. So in a sense, the 1950s debate did, I think, anticipate that machines would require something like an affective pull of an appetite. We often think about notions of being data hungry. And they concluded that it would be necessary to provide the machine with something corresponding to appetites or springs of action. And this spring of action that was talked about in the debate, I've always found that a really fascinating notion, the spring of action. So for me, it's something like Derrida's notion of a decision worthy of the name, that is not just rules-based, not just following the logic of the rules, but something which is a spring and which actually has a capacity to generate something in excess of the rules, in excess of the sequence of instructions. So we might say then that this is no longer a peculiarity of human animals, that algorithms are themselves adjusting to the features of their data environment. And I think even in this mid-20th century debate, the mathematics and the philosophy of machine learning was centering on the sort of enmeshment of human and machine, or the entanglement of human and machine. The question was, but who was learning, you or the machine, you know, wanting to locate that agency? And Turing's reply, we both were. And I've been very interested for a long time in this we both were. Who is the we of the we both were? And I think in our contemporary moment, what we may think of as algorithmic decision or as machine autonomy actually extends the already multiple body with Amoore and others via the kind of sinewy techniques of neural network algorithms, so that the conditions of the spring of action are actually an incalculable communion of data points, patterns, and attributes, none of them quite possessed by us. So none of them quite mappable to what we might think of as identifiable subjects. So then less a question of autonomy, at least in the sense of autonomous agents, where, again, I think the predominant ethical concerns today are about autonomous decisions or mistakes made by machines that are somehow out of the control of humans. But I'm suggesting we need to think differently. And that this might mean, in a sense, you know, revisiting ideas of freedom. You know, there's a very nice interview with Michel Foucault in his final year of life, actually, where he's asked about freedom, and he says, I've always been suspicious of the notion of liberation, for he says, practices of freedom will be needed. And I find that really interesting in the context of the things I'm talking about here, that to liberate human freedoms from their relations with machines would never be sufficient. So that means that the encoded ethics that are so widely talked about by governments and by the tech companies will never be sufficient. The practices of freedom will always be in question and will always be something that needs a kind of continual work. So let's take up this we involved in algorithmic autonomies through the extracted features of a data environment. And I want to reflect on an area of life which I did some fieldwork for my book, looking at robotic surgery and how machine learning algorithms are being used for what's described as autonomous learning in robot surgery. At the level of the algorithms and those designing them, there's little distinction between autonomous surgery in terms of its use of data and algorithms and autonomous weapon systems and other technologies that the very same teams are working on. So you can see on the screen here data visualizations, which are a tracking of the movements of the hands of the surgeon, the human surgeon, but mediated via the robotic instruments on the Da Vinci surgical robot that you can see there on the screen. So the image on the left, which has kind of regularity, is an expert process of a 4-throw surgical stitching. So described by the computer scientists, they say, you know, I'm quoting them here, there's a possibility of automating this task to reduce the cognitive workload of the surgeon. So it's interesting to me, this, because it's about this notion of this kind of distributed cognition between the machine learning algorithms that are animating the robot and the actions of the surgeon. And I think this is very close to what Catherine Hales suggests in her book Unthought, where she describes cognition as something which is distributed across human and non-human agents. So she says, when we design technical systems, we are also partially designing ourselves. So though an action, and in a sense, there is a kind of desire here to have an autonomous action, at least to the extent that for a robot to be able to close using surgical stitches is considered a way of relieving the surgeon of the task, but also regularizing that task and optimizing it. So something which might be a matter of kind of haptic routine for human surgeons requires, as described here, complex machine learning algorithms. So my point with all of this is really that to make a future action possible, there's a very specific relationship to past data on past events. So the future human surgeon will learn the optimal surgical gestures via the robot simulator, and the robot surgeon will suture autonomously via exposure to that data of the past gestures of the surgeon. And in this case, it's the hand gestures, but now also eye tracking is being used to try to model what would be optimal forms of attentiveness and attention in surgery. So as the actions of a singular surgeon attract in the API of the robot, they're communing with a model that's generated from the patterns of really a vast multiplicity of past surgical gestures, which then modify the model and optimize the future gestures of future surgeons and robots as yet unknown. So my point here, my question really is, what is an autonomous action then in this context? Rather, as the Turing debate had anticipated, that the algorithms extract features from the plenitude of their data environment, providing a spring of action to act on future states of being. This multiplicity that we see with the surgical robot is present also in the algorithms for autonomous vehicles, autonomous weapon systems, smart borders, so that each time we hear autonomy in relation to algorithms, I would like us to think of the multiple data fragments lodged within. And I think there's something interesting here, perhaps in relation to Karen Barad's work also on the apparatuses of science and the way that they become the condition of possibility of what matters and what can be said to be mattering in a particular model. So in every singular action of an apparently autonomous system, I'm saying that inside that action resides a kind of teeming set of human and algorithmic gestures, nested one inside the other, gestures, judgments, assumptions, thresholds, probabilities, and outputs. And I think that for our kind of contemporary society, and this is really very close to what Chris and Oliver opened the colloquium with yesterday in terms of the sorts of debates that we have in our society, I think that this raises then a problem in terms of this figure I want to just move to discuss now, the figure of the human in the loop. So with machine learning, from predictive policing technology through facial recognition, through these kind of health-based algorithms I've talked about, what is most commonly thought to be at stake politically and ethically is this degree of autonomy afforded to machines vis-à-vis the human as a locus of decision. So that means that this human in the loop is a very widespread idea, a notion in so many areas. You can see here from the science press and the sort of the discussion of needing to keep humans in the loop, or to ensure that there's always a human in the loop in machine learning. And I want to suggest something rather different from what I think is this dominant kind of social or societal response, to say that the principal ethico-political problem does not arise from autonomous machines breaching the imagined binds of human control, but emerges instead from a machine learning that is generating new limits and thresholds of what it means to be human. And that then part of our focus should be, well, so then what is this human in the loop? Because it seems to me that the human who is part of this we in machine learning is altered, even in their embodied sense of their own agency. And this is something in my research that I've really noticed across so many different domains, from discussions with oncology surgeons who describe a change in what they consider to be operable. So whether or not a tumour is considered to be operable, through to an algorithm-assisted border guard who might describe how their intuition has become partially automated and that they are assisted through their relationship to the screened risk scores that are produced by neural networks, through to those who are talking about understanding what a protest is and is not. So my point is that this human who is part of the we is also altered even in their embodied understanding of what their agency is. And I think, as Catherine Hales reminds us in her account of the post-human, which is more than 20 years old now, actually, but she's very clear there that the idea of the post-human does not mean the end of humanity, she writes. She says, it signals instead the end of a certain conception of the human, a conception that might have applied, she says, at best to that fraction of humanity who've had the wealth and power to conceptualize themselves as autonomous beings. So I think, in common with feminist accounts of embodied technoscience, Donna Haraway's work on objectivity, for example, and her notion that all forms of objectivity are also embodied and partial, that there's not some removed agent that is the observer, or what she calls the kind of God's eye view outside of the practice. So in this sense, autonomy is always already in question. And I think that here the work on race and technology is crucial. So Ruhr Benjamin's recent book on race after technology, but also Simone Brown's book, Dark Matters, in which here the very question of who or what could ever be considered to exercise agency, and who or what could ever be able to make a political claim in that sense, is itself in question. So when the neural network algorithms animating a particular set of technologies are thriving on a multiplicity of training data from human and machinic patterns, who precisely is the figure of the human in the loop? The human, with a definite article, the, it seems to me stands in for a more plural and indefinite life, which is also about the potentialities that are not directly mappable onto the bodies of individuals, but which are about the capacity for communities, for example, to make claims or to have their voices heard in public space. So where humans who are already multiple are generating the emergent effects in communion with algorithms, this is potentiality, and this is the thing that I am, I guess, most concerned about in terms of what is threatened by the technology itself. And it means we have to pose the problem differently, so that it's not so much a question of placing limits on the actions of algorithms adjudicated by an autonomous human in the loop, but instead making that limit, that threshold, itself the subject of study. So algorithms as limit devices, as forms of dividing and apportioning the world and dividing and apportioning people in the world. So that their adjustment of thresholds, weights and parameters is, I think, changing what freedom and autonomy could mean in the world. So the computational problem of how to recognize people and things, which is, fundamental, I think, also to what we're talking about in relation to freedom, the condition of recognition and the risk that when we risk not being recognized when in the kind of political forum. This has been, for computer scientists, the recognition problem is such an important kind of commercial issue that computer scientists actually enter their experimental algorithms in competitive image and object recognition contests. And one specific algorithm, you can see the test images there in the top right, is called AlexNet. It's a deep convolutional neural network, and it won a competition in 2012, and it has become the basis for most of our contemporary recognition technologies. The original scientific paper is cited more than 60,000 times. And I think I want to say, that none of the contemporary uses of facial recognition would be as they currently are without this initial use of data that was happening in 2012. So the AlexNet algorithm, I want to say, is here giving an account of itself, So in the book, I argue that accountability in itself is insufficient in relation to thinking about algorithmic accountability, and that we should be looking instead to think about how algorithms already are ethico-political beings that give accounts of themselves, but partial accounts in the sense that Donna Haraway and Judith Butler and others are describing. And this is, I guess, perhaps a kind of anti-autonomy. That is, that the account is an account of the conditions of its emergence in its relations with the world and with others. So that this self-formation is never self-learning, it's always a relational kind of learning. And what I think this manifests is the contingency of the output of the algorithm, the fragility of the output, and its exposure to the features of its training data. So I'd like you to consider, just have a little look at the image there, top right, that if this algorithm is deciding, is it a leopard, or how likely is it that this is a shipping container, then it's now also being deployed to decide, is this a face? Is this the same face we saw in this protest last week? Or is this a healthy kidney, for example, in the context of surgery? And as the designers of this algorithm describe, I'm quoting them here, they say, objects in realistic settings exhibit considerable variability. So to learn to recognize them, it is necessary to use much larger training sets. So this neural network was trained on 15 million labeled images. That's very small now in contemporary terms. You can see there the 8 test images for the algorithm with the 5 labels considered most probable by the model assigned beneath each image. So the algorithm is able to recognize a previously unseen image of a leopard or a motor scooter because the feature vectors of the image have a close proximity to those encountered in the training data. When the algorithm fails to recognize an entity, the grill, the cherry, the scientists referred to what they call genuine ambiguity of which object is the focus of the image. So to be clear, what I'm saying is that the logic of this algorithm is that if one exposes it to sufficient data on the variability of what something could be, then it will learn to anticipate all future instances of that thing. So indeed, we might say, well, these neural networks are exposed to infinite variabilities across multiple spheres of our lives now. So variabilities in voting behaviours, faces in crowds, credit histories, social media hashtags, sentiment. So in order to recognise the feature vectors of all future instances, and in a sense, there is a kind of, in the book I call it a space of play, there's an experimentation, there is a kind of exercise of a sort of freedom happening in the generation of these algorithms. They are not simple rule-based decision procedures of just if and then. And that means that the spring of action, to come back to this point of the idea of an action, to detain someone on the basis of a facial recognition algorithm, or to stop someone at a border, for example, I want to say its condition of possibility is in very mundane algorithms like the AlexNet algorithm and the exposure to contingent variabilities that happen in the algorithm. Where would the human be in this iterative loop? You know, if we were to insist on this human in the loop, where would we find this human? And I think this is the neural net-based problem that extends from recognizing and grasping the shape of a human organ in noisy surgical data through to the recognition of civilian vehicles in the screened data of autonomous weapon systems. What appears to us as autonomous action is actually generated through an unrecoverable archive of cloud data filtered via an infinitely malleable value system in the algorithms of weights, probabilities, thresholds, and bias, playfully adjusted. You know, it's experimental adjustment with profound political consequences. So for me, this is a pressing problem of the ethics of algorithms for our contemporary moment. All of our handwritten digits, our online traces, biometric templates of our faces and our gait, the movements of hands, eyes, bodies of surgeons, pilots, soldiers, consumers. These are the teeming conditions of possibility of machine learning algorithms. We are, in a sense, within it, and it is us. We couldn't stand outside to adjudicate on it if we wanted to. Whose is the grasp that caused the injury? Which of the 15 million images, which of the many tens of thousands or millions of cloud-derived motions was responsible for this autonomous motion that intuitively decided to pull the trigger, so to speak? Could there be a meaningful autonomy and something like accountability or responsibility, given the extent of collaboration and exposure to the data of our world that I'm describing? So in the last 2 minutes or so, I want to draw towards a conclusion, to move to some kind of concluding comments. And to really sort of reiterate, I think, that the harm done, what I'm saying is that the harm done here potentially is not primarily the seeding of a kind of imagined human control in relation to algorithms. Instead, I want to say that the principal harm is a specific threat to the notion that we live together and decide uncertainly together in the face of difficult or intractable dilemmas. So the damage, in a sense, is to an open future, to the idea that things could be otherwise, when one decides already in advance what the attributes of the protest might be, or the attributes of an undecided voter might be, then we foreclose something which I think is crucial to our political lives, to our capacity to live with one another. So the claim to sort of decide in the face of uncertainty via algorithms, which of course is the attractiveness of them to so many authorities, states and private authorities, forecloses other potential futures, even where the neural networks themselves actually embody a teeming multiplicity. So put really simply, that there's a great harm, I think, in the reduction to a single actionable output from that multiplicity. So the spring of action comes from a single actionable output. And let's not forget that that output, expressed as a numeric value between 0 and 1, lies behind, the risk score at the border, the target assessment of a weapon system, a decision on immigration, on detention, on prison sentencing, or on the incipient dangers of a gathered protest on a city street. So it is a likelihood score. It is a fragile, contingent likelihood score, and a tiny adjustment of the weighting or a shift in the input data will radically change that output score and therefore the spring of action. So for us, I think that this means that what seems to be the opacity of the algorithm should then not be the end point of ethics. And the quote I have on the screen there from Butler, that if a certain opacity persists because I cannot make myself fully accountable, is this ethical failure, or does it give rise to a certain ethical disposition? Is my starting point really, in terms of a cloud ethics, to think about actually, yes, an opacity persists, and this is precisely the grounds on which we need to think about the practice of freedom and the ethics of that practice. So read against a critique of algorithms as unable to give accounts of themselves or as unaccountable, I want to demand that we seek these partial accounts to reopen the branching points and the multiplicity of those algorithms, because we cannot know who is learning in the we, whose intuition is the condition of action. Perhaps we must say that the residue of the algorithm is in us and we are in it. And I think, thinking back to the discussions last night, that this difficult calling to account is not a new problem. for the humanities and the social sciences. Rather, what I'm asking for, I think, exposes vividly a persistent philosophical problem of grounding action, grounding ethics and grounding responsibility in some kind of knowing subject, the very impossibility, if you like, of a clear-sighted account. So just a sort of a final line to conclude, this is a time when, you know, the discussion in this colloquium and the practices of freedom are newly encountering this reduced output of the algorithm. And so there is a great deal at stake. We can see it in of course, the pandemic and the connection of differential freedoms, differential circulations and mobilities to clusters of risk identified through data and secured through a biometric. So what would we do? We would insist on its indeterminacy. We would insist on its contingency and its already political character. Thank you for listening.